Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature, an introductory guide to safari photography in India, presented by NatHab Expedition Leader Aditya Panda. I am your host, Rob Mess. Thank you all so much for being here with us today. And now I'll hand it over to you, Aditya.
Thank you, Rob. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another Natural Habitat presentation. Today's topic is on safari photography in India, but you could use most of the things that you learned today on photo expeditions anywhere. Let me introduce myself again. My name is Aditya Panda, and I have been leading NatHab photo expeditions since 2016. Now, before we start the presentation, I'll request Rob to turn my webcam off so that I can save on bandwidth. Thank you, Rob. When we travel to faraway lands on a much anticipated trip, we want to make the best of it. The memories we make will last a lifetime, and it's always worthwhile to try and document them in some way to share with friends and to look at them nostalgically back at home. Photography is the commonest and most obvious way to do this. However, not everyone might be serious photographers. Many might only have a passing interest in photography or even none. But the memories one creates on expeditions like these deserve to be preserved well. Here it becomes crucial that regardless of the camera one is carrying, one does justice to the photos that one takes. Moments experienced on expeditions such as a safari to India or Africa are not repeated often, and many experiences can be once in a lifetime. Today's webinar will teach you how to make the best of whatever camera you're carrying when you go on a NatHab expedition, regardless of whether it's a digital SLR, a point and shoot, or even a smartphone. Of course, a lot of what I'm going to speak about today will already be known to serious photographers and the pros. I'll do a separate India-specific webinar for pro photographers at a later date. So, what is the best camera for your trip? I'd say it's the camera you're traveling with. Some people like to buy a camera specifically for a trip and struggle to use it. Others are seasoned and understand their gear well. Some others might only use a simple point and shoot camera or a smartphone for their trip. Regardless of whichever of these categories you fit into, I promise you'll be a better photographer if you practice what I have to teach today. So let's go over some of the basic rules of photography. You see, most of us tend to center our subjects when we take a photograph. That is a very natural tendency, but it might not look very appealing later. So there's a very simple rule called the rule of thirds, which all of us can use while framing pictures. If you divide your screen into 3 equal portions, vertically and horizontally, and you place your subject at the junction of any of these 2 or 3 lines, your subject will end up looking well. Horizons can be placed along one of the horizontal lines on the rule of third grid. In a lot of cameras and even phones, you can actually turn this grid on using, by going into your settings. Of course, while you're framing your subject along the rule of thirds, it's important to ensure, which side of your subject you want to provide more space on. Typically, it's better to leave more space on the side that the subject is looking towards, so that gives some sense of continuity. Another important aspect of photography is called depth of field. Of course, on point and shoot cameras and smartphones, this might not be very easy to control, but it's still useful to know about it. Depth of field basically shows the depth up to which the contents of your photograph are in focus. If you have a shallow depth of field, it keeps your subject in focus but blurs everything else out. If you have a deep depth of field, for example, how you'd want it in a landscape photograph, there you have your subject, the horizon, and everything else in your frame in sharp focus. If you use leading lines, say from things such as roads or streams or some other natural feature in your photograph to draw attention to your subject, that ends up giving a very pleasing picture. As you all know, your exposure is controlled by 3 different factors, primarily shutter speed, aperture, and your ISO. And I'll tell you more about those now. Now this picture is from a little cheat sheet that we hand out to our guests on safaris. And this figure here is a very easy way to understand what aperture does. Now the aperture is, it's simply like the pupils of our eyes. It's an iris through which light passes through your lens into your camera and onto the sensor that's recording the picture. So by controlling the aperture, you can control the amount of light that you allow into your frame. The number for the measurement for aperture is in inverse figures. So the smaller the number, the wider the aperture, the more amount of light that comes in. And interestingly, the shallower the depth of field. If you are taking pictures, say portraits of a person or an animal, you would want to use as wide an aperture as possible. That will not only give you a nice shallow depth of field that makes your subject pop out of the background, it'll also allow a lot of light, which will allow you to use a higher shutter speed, which is the duration for which light is allowed onto your sensor. And using a high shutter speed ensures that your subject is sharp and the chances of shake are minimized. While shooting landscape pictures, you should ideally try and use a narrow depth of field by using a narrow aperture, like say 8, 11, 16 or higher. That will give a sharper image all through, giving you a sharper background. If you have any questions about all of this, of course, do remember to ask me later in the Q&A section. Now, we spoke about shutter speed and aperture. Let's speak about ISO. The ISO is, for those of you who have ever used film cameras, if you remember the film negatives and slides that used to come in those days, used to carry a number called the ASA with figures such as 100, 200, 400, 800, etc. Now, that refers to the sensitivity of the film, or in case of digital cameras today, the digital sensor. Now, the lower the sensitivity, the longer the sensor needs to be exposed to light. Which means that on at an ISO setting of say 100, you'll need to use a lower shutter speed and a wider aperture. This will ensure that you get enough light to form your image. And at lower ISOs, you get much higher picture quality. the lowest ISO gives the highest picture quality. And it's great to use these ISOs at times, when there's plenty of natural light in a safari situation, for example. And when the light begins to go down, you can bump up your ISO, and that will allow you to take, narrower apertures and faster shutter speeds at lower light, and still capture usable images. But the problem with high ISOs is that they end up in causing a lot of noise in the image that you end up getting. A lot of digital SLRs and mirrorless SLRs, and even a lot of the prosumer cameras, as they are called, the bridge cameras, they manage pretty good highest ISO performance today. Even smartphones these days are capable of pretty high quality images at the higher ISO settings. So typically in a safari situation where speed or shutter speed is of extreme importance, because you don't want any shake in your pictures, and wildlife is usually moving, so it's very important not to end up getting any shake in your pictures. It's advisable to not go below, say, an ISO rating of 400, unless, of course, you are in extremely bright light where you can afford to go down up to ISO 100 or 200 to get much better quality. Typically, what I do is I shoot in a range of 400 to 1600 at most times of the day, and at dawn and dusk, which is usually prime time of the day to take wildlife pictures, I can sometimes go up as high as ISO 6400 or probably even higher. My advice here would be, when in doubt, caution on the side of higher ISO, because a noisy image is still more usable than a shaken or a blurred image. Also, on your cameras and even phones, you'll often find a setting for controlling exposure, which is usually measured in thirds. And if you leave your camera at your exposure setting at 0, then the camera will shoot at whatever exposure it thinks, the metering in it thinks is right for the situation. However, in certain situations, for example, if you're if you're photographing a dark subject against a bright background, you might want to overexpose a bit, because your camera might be metering for the bright background, and that will end up making your subject look much darker. Similarly, in certain situations, you can also underexpose your pictures to caution on the side of speed. Now, before we start on tips and tricks and do's and don'ts for photography in a safari situation, it's very important to keep in mind that you need to keep your gear prepared. You see, I can assure you, one of the best ways to have fantastic sightings while out on safari is to forget to charge your camera battery, or to download the pictures from yesterday's safari from your cards. And fantastic wildlife experiences tend to happen just when we forget to do those things. So always remember to charge your batteries, to keep your cards empty, your memory cards empty, before you go out on a game drive. And as I'll explain later in the presentation, on safari situations, you end up getting a lot of dust on your camera and lenses and binoculars, and sometimes even dew and occasionally rain. So once you get back to your lodge, it's very important to clean up your equipment. Of course, one of the main rules of being successful on a safari expedition is to have a good guide. A seasoned, experienced guide can make or break your safari experience. Of course, with NatHab, you don't have to worry about that because we pride ourselves on the quality and the experience of our expedition leaders. Now, of course, I said that whatever equipment you're carrying is ultimately the best equipment you have, and you should make the best of it. But if you do want to take your photography seriously, or if you find yourself taking an interest in the subject, then it's worthwhile to try and carry the best equipment you can on trips like these. Of course, buying the biggest lenses is a very expensive affair. So there are other options. You can always borrow lenses of the same amount as your camera from friends. I don't know if you have friends like that, because none of my friends lend me their lenses. Of course, there are some people who might want to buy a particular camera and a lens just for a holiday of this sort. And there's always the option to rent equipment. If you have a DSLR, especially, regardless of whatever brand it is always possible to rent larger lenses, longer lenses, specifically for these trips, and that's a far more economic option to buying equipment specifically for a trip. Now, while on safari, it's very, very important to be patient and to keep looking. Action happens when you least expect it, and you've got to be prepared. And patience always pays when out looking for wildlife, because regardless of what we might want, the animals follow their own timetable, and it's always worthwhile to wait at places such as waterholes or salt licks or meadows, and keep a sharp eye and ear out for any kind of wildlife action that might happen. A lot of times, while on safari in India, we stop in places where there are no other jeeps. Everybody might have just driven through, not seeing much happening. And when you turn the engine off and wait there for 10 minutes or 15 minutes and just listen, sometimes you start hearing alarm calls from animals like deer and monkeys and peafowl, and that often indicates the presence of a predator. And in situations like these, it's always a reminder that just driving around aimlessly is of little use. It's very important to stop and wait at crucial places, and just wait and watch and listen, because that is ultimately what gets you the best sightings. Of course, again, with expeditions on with natural habitat, you will have fantastic expedition leaders and local guides who will ensure that your game drives are planned fantastically. Now, all said and done, your best gear is ultimately your mind. How you picture a scene, how you frame it, how you decide to show your subject in camera is ultimately what is going to get you fantastic images. It's not just the gear. Now, I've always been looking for opportunities to put my dog pictures into my presentations, and today I have a chance. This is one of my puppies. He's called Zar, And I often just practice my photography on him when I'm at home and not on safari. I just love to photograph my own dogs, or just birds in my garden, or the local wildlife in places on the outskirts of my city, or local national parks and wildlife sanctuaries. So before you go on an expedition, such as one to India or Africa or anywhere else in the world with natural habitat, and particularly if you are unfamiliar with your gear, then it's very useful to start practicing maybe a month or so in advance of your trip, so that you really get to know your gear and you get to practice your skills and fine tune them before you go into the real action on safari. And while doing that, there's also a lot of homework you could do. You can always look at the work of other photographers, see, how they compose their subjects, what kind of scenes they try and create, and you can learn a lot from that. And it's always worthwhile to try and learn how to process your images, because uh, like it happened in the film days, you shot a picture with slide film or negative, and then you took it to a lab to have it processed, to get the best out of it, to get the best colors, to get the best composition. And you can still do that with digital images. Every digital image can be improved. And of course, there's a fine line between manipulation and processing. And of course, ethically, I'm personally against manipulating an image to the extent that the content of the image changes and the honesty of the photograph goes. But it's always worthwhile to process your images and to get the best colors, the best sharpness, and the best composition out of them. So you needn't you needn't have to go through an entire course in Adobe Photoshop, for example, but there are very simple softwares these days on our phones, on our computers, that we can use to control the basics, such as color, saturation, contrast, brightness, sharpness, etc., and crop our pictures to our own taste. For those of you who do a lot of mobile photography, who shoot with your phones, one app that I find very useful is called Snapspeed, which you can download and install on your phones, and it's fantastic. If you want to improve as a photographer, when you share your pictures with friends and family and other photographers, genuinely ask for critique. That really helps. Everybody will praise your pictures, especially when they're taken in exotic locations of rare wild animals. But if you want to go above and beyond that, ask for critique, ask what could be improved, use that as a learning experience. And of course, there are lots of new techniques that you can learn. And at the end of this presentation, I'll point you to a great source for learning such techniques. And of course, besides learning about the technicalities of photography, it's very useful to learn about your subject and your destination before you travel. The more research you do, the better prepared you'll be. Of course, your expedition leader is going to teach you everything and answer all your questions. But if you do some homework, and if you're prepared before you even leave home, then you're going to be ending up getting much better results out in the field. And of course, there are a lot of NatHab webinars on photography, so just watch them. one of the commonest mistakes I see, guests doing with their photography is to mess up their composition. Like I said in the beginning, of course, a lot of people tend to center their subject, and that doesn't look very good, once the picture is taken. So very important to follow the rule of thirds. Another very common mistake that I see is that people sometimes forget to keep their camera level. Now, if you don't keep your horizon straight, if the horizon looks tilted, then that ends up messing up the entire picture. Of course, you can correct it in post-processing, but you'll end up losing out a lot of the picture in that sort of corrective cropping that you'll have to do later. While photographing animals, especially if they're near bushes or in thick vegetation, there can be distracting twigs and leaves and other things that can really make the background look really busy. And sometimes in the heat of the moment, in the excitement of the moment, while shooting a rare wild animal, we tend to miss things such as a twig in front of the face, or covering the eye, which later ends up looking very ugly. So try and keep these things in mind. Try to move a little bit and change the background so that you have a nice clean background to the extent possible. And our eyes are tuned. When we look at a picture, our eyes naturally get drawn to the brightest part of the picture. So while framing your subject, watch out for distracting highlights in the background, any bright objects in the background, or say again, while photographing an animal in canopy or in thick bushes, even sunlight coming in from behind can become an ugly distraction. So watch out for those things. And of course, in wildlife photography, it is crucial to focus on the animal's eyes, because there's a saying in wildlife photography that if the eyes of the animal are in focus, then the rest of the animal is in focus enough. It doesn't matter how sharp the rest of the animal is, as long as the eye is in focus. So speaking of busy backgrounds again, when you see an animal hiding in a bush, try and focus on the eye of the animal. You might have to do this manually, using your manual focus dial on your camera, or if you're shooting on a point and shoot or a phone, then you might have to touch your screen at the spot where the animal's eye is to get it into focus. Another very, very common mistake: people forget to stabilize their cameras when taking pictures, especially in a safari situation where it's impossible to use a tripod because you're in a moving vehicle. And when there are other people in the vehicle, there's absolutely no point putting a tripod in, even if the engine is turned off and the vehicle is stationary, because there'll always be some amount of shake that's going to make a tripod useless. So in safari situations, we prefer using bean bags, especially for our longer lenses. But even if you have a smaller camera, it's always useful to stabilize it on a bean bag, or even your own backpack, or just a folded up jacket, or anything that you can find to get as much stability as possible. Because as it is, your subject is likely to be moving around a lot, and to prevent shake in the image is of crucial importance. And camera shake just adds to that. So while on safari, if you stop to take pictures, wait till your driver turns the engine off, and you can always ask your driver to stop the vehicle and turn the engine off before you start taking pictures. Because if you take pictures while the Jeep is still running, then there are very high chances, even if you're stationary and the engine is only idling, there are very high chances that there's going to be camera shake creeping in. And of course, if your device, your phone, your point and shoot camera, or your big telephoto lens has an image stabilization feature, it's always important to remember to turn it on, because sometimes we just forget to change the settings, and a lot of times when there are switches such as this here on your camera, those switches might accidentally get turned off, and you might end up getting camera shake. Another common mistake that I see is that people sometimes forget to change the setting that controls the quality of picture that your camera records. With SLRs and on some phones these days, it is possible to record your images in the RAW format. The RAW format is basically like a digital negative. It's it's absolute raw information that the camera captures as it is, that you can later process on a computer to get the very best out of your picture. And some people just choose not to use it or forget to use it, and they end up shooting in JPEG, which is a compressed format, and causes a fair amount of quality loss. And pictures taken in the JPEG format in low light, for example, cannot be improved much in post-processing. So it's important to choose the best setting, the best quality that your camera offers. Now, even if it does not shoot RAW, even if it shoots only in JPEG, then try and choose the fine quality, which is basically the highest quality, because that will give you the most amount of detail and will allow you to print to the largest size possible. Now, when you go to a camera shop or shop online for a camera, the website that you shop on, or the dealer that you, the shopkeeper that you deal with in the shop, will often, encourage you to buy a UV filter to put on your lens, claiming it to be good for your pictures, and that it cuts out UV light, and that it protects your lens. I would strongly advise against going for this gimmick. UV filters have no use in the digital world. On film cameras, they were useful because film actually did register UV light, but in the digital world, they're absolutely of no use. And it's just a cheap piece of glass that you're putting in front of your expensive, high quality lens, and it does nothing to improve the quality of the image. In fact, it significantly reduces the sharpness of the image that you end up getting. Digital sensors do not register UV light, so you do not really need a UV filter. A lot of times, people forget to put their lens hood on. That goes a long way in cutting down flare and adding a lot more detail to the quality of your image. Always use a lens hood, especially while on safari, because not only will it help you get better quality pictures, it's also going to prevent the front element of your lens from accidentally bumping into things in a moving vehicle. There's a tendency we have to zoom as much as possible. Now, that's not always useful. Of course, you need to zoom because with wildlife, you need to try and get in as close as possible to try and get as much of the animal on your frame as possible. but don't always fall in for the tendency to do that. A lot of times it's much nicer to capture the animal in its landscape. You know, you can tell a story through that. There's so much going on around the animal and its landscape, and you know, try not to zoom in all the time. Another problem with doing that, especially with point and shoot cameras or even SLRs for that matter, is that if the animal is way too far away, you know, and there's all sorts of distractions that come in the way. There's haze and a lot of other things that just ruin the quality of your image if you just zoom in on a really far off subject. Also on digital cameras, you know, they might advertise 500x or whatever x zoom, but a lot of times the actual optical zoom, that is the lens's own capability to zoom, is much lesser, and the rest of it is actually just a digital zoom wherein the picture is cropped to try and get you closer to the subject. Now that always ends up ruining the quality of your picture. I'd always advise you know, to crop later in post-processing than using digital zoom. And you know, when a subject is really far away, just put your camera down, enjoy it through your binoculars. It's you know, far more useful that way. And again, if your subject is very far away, there's always the opportunity to use the video function in your camera. That will give you much more pleasing results, especially if the animals are doing something interesting, than forcefully taking a still picture from you know, absolute telescopic distances. That apart, you know, every camera these days has a very nice, very useful video feature, including phones. And a lot of times, you know, it's far better to shoot video than pictures. Now, I'll just play this video that I had taken of a tigress on a kill at Ranthambore Tiger Reserve on our India Tiger Quest. You see, in this case, we had spent quite some time with these animals and had taken plenty of pictures to a point that all of them started to look like each other. And it just wasn't worth it trying to take stills anymore. So I used the opportunity to film a video, and you know, the result ended up being far more interesting than the still pictures that I had taken. Now, for those of you who do not want to get into the technicalities of operating a camera, who do not want to think about exposure and ISO and, you know, shutter speed and all of that, here are a few very simple hacks that you could use while out on safari. By all means, try and avoid using the auto function of your camera, because you know, that's literally automated and it cannot always judge the scene for what it is. But there are some sections under the auto function of most cameras, and if you look at your settings or the dials on your camera, then most of them have these options. Even in phones, you have these different modes that you can take pictures in. So you know, typically for wildlife, while you're out on a game drive, the sport mode of your camera will automatically sort of tune it to have settings that are meant for fast-moving subjects, which perfectly suits wildlife requirements. When you're taking landscape photos, for example, you know, there's a landscape mode that is typically shown by a pair of hills. And when you're taking people photos, which you very often will in destinations like these, there's a portrait mode that's very useful. The portrait mode is also useful while taking portraits of animals, because the settings required for it are very similar. But I prefer the running man mode for wildlife photography, because then it also ensures that your camera chooses a higher ISO, and that the camera is in continuous autofocus mode and in burst mode, where it shoots a series of images for as long as you keep the shutter pressed. For shooting flowers, butterflies, insects, especially when you have time at your lodge between game drives, the macro mode, which is shown by a flower, is very useful. Now, here are a few things to keep in mind while on safari in India. Your camera requirements, and what gear to carry, and all of that will depend a lot on these things. Most of the time when we are photographing wildlife in India, we are on a game drive in jeeps. And while you're on a game drive, you're not allowed to get out of your jeep and be on foot. So consider that in mind, and avoid carrying a tripod or a monopod. Monopods might still be useful, but avoid by all means carrying a tripod all the way from the United States to India, only to figure out that you can't really use it on a jeep. So a bean bag is a lot more useful there. And all our jeeps, on photo trips and even regular trips, always have bean bags in them for our guests to use. Also keep in mind that game drives in India, like game drives in Africa or anywhere else, are bumpy and can often be dusty. So very important to protect your equipment from getting covered in dust, or especially from falling off the Jeep. So camera safety is something that you should keep in mind while on safari here. And again, very important, don't spend your entire trip looking through your viewfinder. Don't forget to actually watch. With experience, a lot of people understand when to shoot, and when it's not worth shooting anymore, and it's far better to watch. And when you watch, you experience the real thing and you see so much more. There are, of course, ethics and etiquette that one needs to abide by while indulging in wildlife photography anywhere. There are local rules, of course, in wildlife sanctuaries and national parks that you visit, and it's very important to obey them. And the most important rule for any wildlife photographer anywhere in the world is to give your subject, the wildlife that we so love, the space that they need. We should never ever end up stressing an animal out, invading its space. It's very important to not do that under the tendency and the urge to try and get a great picture. Similarly, never pressure your guide to compromise your safety or the safety of your subject in the effort to try and get a great picture. On game drives, it's often easy to block other people's view, so it's always useful to be a little mindful of that, and not be blocking other people's view while being engaged in taking pictures. And while on a game drive, always ask your driver or your guide before standing up, even if your vehicle is stationary. It might not be appropriate in many situations, and it's important for them to know that you're standing up in the interest of your own safety. And of course, if you want to move your Jeep around, take a consensus. Some other people's views might be getting blocked, so there you can just take turns. And very important, always trust your expedition leader or your driver or your local guide or tracker who's in your Jeep with you. They know the best spots, and they understand the animals that they're showing you. So the moment you see an animal, your tendency is usually to stop immediately and take pictures, but they might know a better spot where you'll get a clear view or where the light is right. And speaking of light, always try and keep the sun behind you so that your animal is well lit. Of course, you can always make beautiful pictures with the sun behind the animal and get some nice silhouettes or backlit images. To learn more about the technicalities of wildlife photography and for other tips and tricks, do visit our wildlife photography tutorial website called naturalphotographer.org. It's full of resources for you to hone in your skills. And with that, I'd like to end my presentation. I look forward to seeing you on safari in India soon. And on this note, let me share some excellent news that we have here in India. India is opening up to international tourism next month. So do get in touch with NatHab on the website. The phone.
Aditya, unfortunately, we're having a hard time understanding you at the moment. We're having some audio difficulties.
Yeah, I just noticed. I was just listing out the two new trips that we have in India now. We have a Photo Pro expedition called India Tiger Safari and a brand new snow leopard trip called Land of the Snow Leopard. And I was asking everybody to look these up on the website. And with that, I'd like to hear what questions everyone has, and I'd love to answer them.
Aditya, could you please repeat the excellent news that you had for us? Because I don't think many of us heard it.
Oh, yeah. There's excellent news from India that next month onwards, India is reopening to international tourism. It's been a long time since COVID that India had been shut to international tourism. So if you want to book your trips to India, if you want to go on a safari expedition to India with Natural Habitat Adventures, please get in touch. I have listed the website, phone number, and the email ID that you can get in touch with to find out more about these expeditions.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I'd like to remind you all that you can submit questions in the question field on your GoToWebinar control panel. And I do have a couple of questions for you right now, Aditya. So that first picture that you showed us, can you tell us what kind of bird that was? It's just a beautiful picture.
That's a rufous tree pie in Ranthambore Tiger Reserve. And over there, some of them can actually be quite tame and come and sit on your Jeep or even on your hat.
Wow, that's great. So let's get to the cameras. What is the slowest shutter speed that you would shoot at? I'm assuming it's different for birds than it is for tigers.
Well, yes, birds are a lot more likely to move around, to flit around than tigers. But even with tigers, they're constantly moving. They're even if they're sitting, they're breathing, they're licking their whiskers. they're looking around, and of course when they're walking, that's quite a lot of movement. So with tigers, I usually wouldn't go below a shutter speed of say 1/500th of a second, and ideally I try to keep it around 1000, just to be on the safe side. Sometimes, of course, in low light situations with a very stationary tiger and with a lot of skill, I have shot, as low as 1/25th of a second, but those will usually end up giving you blurred images. So to be on the safe side with wildlife, try and keep it at 1000, at 1/1000th of a second, and nothing lesser.
So now, if you use autofocus, it can be difficult to get the camera to focus in on something that is not in the center. Do you have any advice for us in that situation?
Well, on most cameras, if you you can move the focus points around. So you just have to compose your scene, and then using the joystick or the arrow keys on your camera, you can move the focus point around to be on the eye of the animal. And if you find that doing that is difficult, or you can always just override with manual focus and get that done. And on some cameras, you cannot, you do not have a ring to manually focus. There you can just touch the eye of the animal on your LCD screen, and your camera will focus for you.
Great, thank you for that. Now, there was some disagreement about the UV filter. People were saying it protects the lens. They've had stones break their lenses before. Now, if you don't think they should use that, do you have any other recommendations if not using a UV filter?
Well, it is true that it protects your lens from bumps and stones and things like that, but it comes at a great cost to the quality of your image, because ultimately the quality of the glass on the UV filter is, it's like shooting through a car windshield when you compare that to the quality of the glass of the optics on your lens. So it does protect your lens, but would you like to do it at that cost is the question I have. That apart, you can always put your lens cap on, or you get these hood covers that you can quickly put on and pull out of your long lenses that do an equally good job of protecting the element.
Great, thank you for that. So for both storage and processing, what are the best cloud-based SW to use for uploading your images for cameras and for iPhones?
Well, for iPhones, of course, you have Apple Cloud, and I use Google Drive a lot, but I still believe in storing my images on a nice solid physical SSD drive and make a couple of backups, because again, cloud space can be expensive, especially at the rate at which people like we shoot, and there's usually poor internet connectivity in areas where we travel. So it's always helpful to carry an actual solid external hard drive and use that.
Great, that's great to know. So let me ask you about the wildlife trips and the snow leopard trips. What is the maximum number of people that you put in each safari vehicle?
Well, on our photo expeditions and photo pro expeditions, there are no more than 2 people, 2 guests per safari vehicle. Of course, there's the driver and the guide, but barring that, we have 2 people in the Jeep, so that each of them get an entire row to themselves to spread their equipment around and get as much room as they can. On a non-photo trips, we have up to 4 people per vehicle. On the snow leopard trip, there are no game drives. It's all we travel in cars, and then we do a lot of hiking and watching on foot. So, vehicles do not figure there.
Great. Well, thank you, Aditya. I really appreciate you taking the time to present for us today, but unfortunately, that's all the time we have left. So I'd like to thank everyone who tuned in. Now join us next week for our daily dose of nature. You can check out next week's lineup, including registration links on our website at nathab.com/webinars. And now, Aditya, I'd like to throw it back to you for a final comment, if you would like to say anything to our friends out there.
Thank you, Rob. I hope all of you enjoyed today's webinar and found it useful. And I look forward to seeing you all again. Thank you.
Thank you, Aditya. And remember to check out the website naturalphotographer.org to get more hints on how to take pictures. And of course, visit our website, nathab.com, to book a trip today. With that, I will conclude today's webinar. Goodbye, everybody. Have a great weekend.